Amanda Clark never wanted problems. She had spent most of her life avoiding unnecessary disputes, preferring to focus on her work rather than meddling in arguments. After inheriting her father's house, she had one mission: preserve his legacy. The house itself was nothing special, just a modest, well-built home with an attached garage that had been her father's workshop for decades. It wasn't just a garage. It was a sanctuary filled with high-end tools, specialized gear, and rare components that he had collected over the years. Her father, Robert Clark, had been a skilled mechanic, known for restoring classic American muscle cars to their original glory. When he passed away, Amanda found herself not just the owner of his property, but the keeper of his craft. She had no intention of letting all of his efforts disappear, and so she stepped into his shoes, continuing the meticulous restoration projects he had once taken on. She wasn't running a business, at least not officially. She worked on cars in her spare time, taking in projects from collectors who appreciated her father's expertise, which she had inherited. The neighborhood, however, was changing. A few years prior, a new group had taken control of the Homeowners Association, turning what was once a simple committee into something closer to a corporate watchdog. The rules became stricter, fines were handed out for the smallest issues, and longtime residents who had once lived peacefully now found themselves dealing with an increasingly controlling set of board members. Amanda had mostly ignored their changes, confident that she wasn't doing anything wrong. But when she received her first violation notice, she realized that ignorance was not going to shield her. The letter stated that her garage was being used for commercial purposes and that this violated zoning laws, despite the fact that she wasn't advertising her work or even having a frequent influx of customers. The language in the letter was unclear, filled with citations of bylaws and legal terms that didn't seem to have a direct connection to her situation. She consulted a lawyer, who assured her that as long as she wasn't operating a full-fledged business with signage, employees, or daily foot traffic, she wasn't breaking any laws. Amanda responded to the violation notice with a formal statement, explaining that she was merely working on personal projects, not conducting a business. The response was ignored. A second letter arrived a week later, this time claiming that she was in violation of property aesthetics rules because she had multiple non-operational vehicles parked on her property. This was another ridiculous claim. Yes, she had a few cars in various stages of restoration, but they were parked inside her fenced yard, not rusting away in plain sight. It was obvious that this wasn't about rule enforcement. It was about targeting her. She began to notice strange occurrences around her property. A car parked down the street at odd hours, someone walking past her house just a little too slowly, their eyes scanning her garage rather than minding their business. She brushed it off as paranoia at first, but when she found deep scratches on her garage lock one morning, she knew she wasn't imagining things. Someone had tried to break in. Amanda replaced the locks with reinforced versions, the kind that required industrial tools to cut through. She also installed security cameras, but something bizarre happened 2 nights later. They stopped functioning for a full hour. When she checked the footage, the entire duration was missing. No glitches, no corrupt files, just a clean gap in the recording. Someone had disabled them. She called the police, but they shrugged it off, saying that without evidence of an actual crime, there wasn't much they could do. Then came the night she heard noises. It was just past midnight when a faint metallic clatter reached her ears from outside. Her bedroom window overlooked the driveway, and when she peeked through the curtains, she saw shadows moving near the garage. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. But before she could even press call, the figures vanished into the darkness. When she went outside with a flashlight, the garage door was still locked, but the handle had been twisted slightly, as if someone had been trying to force it open. The next morning, she found a letter taped to her door. No envelope, no postage, just a plain sheet of paper with a message typed in an almost clinical font. You are in repeated violation of community standards. Further action will be taken. Amanda clenched her fists as she read it. They weren't just fining her anymore. They were making threats. That was when she decided she couldn't handle this alone. She picked up the phone and called her Uncle Henry Clark. Henry had been a police officer for over 25 years before retiring, and he had seen more corruption in his career than he cared to admit. When Amanda explained everything that had happened, the The notices, the harassment, the tampering with her cameras. He didn't hesitate. "I'm coming over," he said. By the time Henry arrived that evening, Amanda had already gone over every piece of evidence she had. Security footage, what little there was left of it, the violation letters, the scratch locks. Henry took one look at the latest letter and exhaled sharply. This isn't some bored neighborhood committee trying to enforce rules. Someone's trying to push you out. Why? Amanda asked. It's just a garage. I'm not breaking any laws. Henry shook his head. It's not about the rules. Someone wants this property, and they're trying to scare you into leaving. Amanda didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore the pattern. If they wanted her gone, the fines weren't working, and neither were the threats, which meant whoever was behind this was going to escalate. She didn't have to wait long for that to happen. 2 days later, Amanda returned from work to find her garage door wide open. Panic shot through her chest as she rushed across the driveway, her heart pounding at the thought of what she might find. The heavy-duty lock, the one she had reinforced, was completely gone, the metal twisted as if it had been pried open with force. Her father's meticulously organized workshop looked like a storm had hit it. Tools were scattered, drawers had been pulled out, and expensive equipment was missing. The sight made her stomach turn. This wasn't a simple break-in. Someone had searched for something. She immediately called Henry, who arrived within minutes, his face hard as he scanned the damage. "Amanda, take a deep breath," he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I need you to tell me exactly what's missing." She went through the inventory, realizing the most valuable tools had been taken, things that weren't just expensive, but irreplaceable. Whoever had done this knew what they were looking for. Henry knelt near the door, running his fingers along the frame. "This wasn't a random burglary," he muttered. "They knew exactly when to strike." Amanda's hands curled into fists. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was personal. Henry stood, his eyes narrowed. Time to set up some real security. That night, they installed motion sensors, additional cameras, and reinforced every entry point. If whoever did this came back, they wouldn't get away so easily. But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next morning, Amanda found a fresh violation notice taped to her door. Her jaw clenched as she ripped it off, scanning the text with growing frustration. This time, the HOA claimed that her garage was in violation of community safety standards, citing concerns over stored chemicals and hazardous equipment. Amanda's stomach turned. They had escalated again. This wasn't about rules. They were creating excuses to justify what had happened. She stormed into her house, slamming the notice onto the table in front of Henry, who was already reviewing the footage from the previous night. "They're covering their tracks," she snapped. "First, they break in, now they're trying to make it official." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "We need to find out who's behind this." Amanda took a breath, trying to think. If this was about the property, then someone stood to gain from her leaving. She pulled out the HOA records and started digging. Within an hour, she found something. The association had recently approved a rezoning proposal, one that would allow commercial development on certain residential lots. Her house was right in the middle of it. Her gut twisted. This wasn't just harassment. This was a scheme. Henry looked over her shoulder, his face darkening. "They're trying to force you out so they can sell this land at a profit." Amanda's hands shook as she gripped the documents. If that was true, then the break-in was just the beginning. Amanda knew she couldn't fight this battle alone, so she decided to go to the HOA meeting in person. She walked into the hall, her head held high, refusing to let them see any hesitation. The board members sat at the front, their expressions unreadable, but the moment she stepped inside, a hush fell over the room. Victoria Hayes, the HOA president, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Miss Clark," she said, her tone carefully measured. "This meeting is for official business." Amanda strode forward, placing the violation notices onto the table with a thud. "Then let's talk business," she replied. "I want to know why I keep getting these notices, especially after my garage was broken into." The murmur in the room grew louder, but Victoria remained calm, folding her hands neatly on the table. "The rules must be enforced," she stated. "Your property has violations, and we are ensuring compliance." Henry, who had come with her, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And what about the security footage showing people tampering with her garage?" The board members exchanged glances, but Victoria kept her smile. If you have evidence, you are free to file a report with the police. Amanda's blood boiled, but she forced herself to stay calm. She reached into her bag, pulling out the rezoning documents. Then explain this, she challenged. The moment the papers hit the table, the room fell silent. The HOA board members shifted, their faces tensing. Amanda's heart pounded. She had just thrown the first punch in a much bigger fight. Victoria's smile faltered for the first time, and Amanda knew she had struck a nerve. The other board members exchanged glances, their once confident expressions now uneasy. Victoria picked up the documents, skimming them with an air of forced indifference. Miss Clark, she began, her tone measured. This is a misunderstanding. The HOA's involvement in rezoning discussions is purely advisory. Amanda folded her arms, her stare unwavering. Then why have I been targeted? Why the harassment? Victoria set the papers down, lacing her fingers together. If you feel wronged, there are proper channels for your concerns. Henry let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. That's funny, because the only proper channel I see is a federal investigation. The room went silent, tension thick as smoke. Amanda placed a USB drive onto the table. This is all the footage, all the letters, and all the financial records I've collected. It goes to the authorities tomorrow, unless you have a better explanation. Victoria's face stiffened, but her eyes flickered with something Amanda recognized: fear. She wasn't in control anymore. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispers breaking out among the residents. Victoria smoothed her blazer, forcing a smile. I see no need for hostility, she said lightly. Perhaps we can discuss this further in a more appropriate setting. Amanda leaned forward, her voice low. I think we just did. The next morning, Amanda received an email from the HOA, claiming her violations had been dropped. She read the message twice, unable to believe the sudden change. Just yesterday, they had been adamant about enforcing their so-called rules, and now they were backing down. Henry, sitting across the table, smirked as he sipped his coffee. They're scared, he said. They know you have them cornered. Amanda wasn't convinced. It felt too easy. She replied to the email, requesting a formal confirmation, but before she could hit send, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, a man in a suit stood there, his posture rigid. Miss Clark, he greeted, extending a card. I'm Richard Hastings, the HOA's legal counsel. Amanda glanced at Henry, who set his mug down, stepping to her side. What can I do for you? She asked, keeping her voice neutral. Hastings adjusted his tie. The board would like to offer a resolution, he said. If you withdraw your complaints, we'll ensure no further action is taken against your property. Amanda's stomach tightened. This wasn't an apology. This was a bribe. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. So, you harass her for weeks, try to break into her garage, and now you want to make it all disappear? Hastings didn't flinch. We simply want to resolve this peacefully. Amanda folded her arms. The problem is I don't trust you. Hastings sighed, pulling a folder from his briefcase. Then perhaps you should see what's at stake. Amanda took the folder, flipping it open, and her blood ran cold. Inside were detailed records, maps of her property, notes on her routine, and even photographs of her garage taken from different angles. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was targeted surveillance. Her hands tightened around the pages as she looked up at Hastings, her stomach churning. What is this? She demanded. Hastings remained calm, adjusting his cufflinks. Just documentation, he said, to ensure all community standards are being upheld. Henry let out a slow, controlled breath, his eyes narrowed. You've been spying on her. This isn't regulation, this is stalking. Hastings didn't react, but there was a hint of discomfort in his expression. Amanda forced herself to stay composed, even as her pulse raced. And if I don't take the deal? Hastings folded his hands, his tone even. Then I can't guarantee what happens next. Amanda closed the folder, feeling the weight of what she was holding. They weren't just pushing her out. They were threatening her. But they had underestimated one thing. She wasn't alone in this fight. She looked at Henry, whose jaw had tightened. We'll be in touch, she said coolly, stepping back into the house. As soon as the door closed, she turned to Henry, her voice firm. We take this higher. Amanda spent the next day contacting lawyers, city officials, and local journalists. She compiled every document, violation notice, and recorded conversation, making sure her case was airtight. Henry, working beside her, made a few calls to his old colleagues in law enforcement. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a full-scale investigation. By the afternoon, Amanda had secured a meeting with a local investigative reporter. When she laid out the evidence, the reporter's eyes widened. "This is more than just harassment," he muttered. "This could be a major corruption scandal." Amanda's heart pounded. "That's what I suspect," she said. "But I need it to be proven." The reporter promised to dig deeper, reaching out to other homeowners who had faced similar issues. Meanwhile, Henry had managed to pull property records from the county, and what they found was shocking. The HOA had been secretly transferring ownership of foreclosed homes to a shell company linked to Victoria. Amanda's stomach churned. They weren't just forcing people out. They were profiting from it. That night, Amanda and Henry laid out everything they had gathered, preparing for the next step. "We take this to the state," Henry said. "We're not just exposing them. We're taking them down." Amanda nodded, determination settling into her bones. If the HOA wanted a fight, they had just lost before it had truly begun. The following morning, Amanda woke up to the sound of tires screeching outside her house. She jolted upright, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. A black SUV had just sped away, leaving behind a thick trail of dust. Amanda's stomach churned as she stepped onto the porch, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of what had happened. Henry was already outside, his jaw tight as he looked around. "They're getting desperate," he muttered. Amanda's eyes landed on something unsettling, a large envelope placed neatly at the foot of her door. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside were printed photos of her walking to her garage, sitting in a cafe, talking to her lawyer. The message was clear. Someone was watching her. Henry snatched the photos, his face darkening. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," he growled. "This is a threat." Amanda took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "We already know they're corrupt. This just proves how far they're willing to go." But Henry wasn't satisfied. "We need to go to law enforcement," he said firmly. Before she could respond, her phone rang. It was the reporter she had met the day before. "Amanda, you need to see this," he said, his voice urgent. "We've connected the dots, and it's bigger than we thought." Amanda and Henry rushed to the news station, ready to see what the reporter had uncovered. As they stepped into the office, the tension in the air was thick. The reporter, a man in his late 40s, gestured toward a large board covered in documents, photographs, and timelines. "We've been digging," he said, "and what we found isn't just local HOA corruption. It's a statewide scheme." Amanda felt her stomach drop as she examined the board. Dozens of names, addresses, and financial records connected to a network of fraudulent property transfers. Henry let out a low whistle. "This is organized," he said. "Not just a few people being greedy. This is systematic." The reporter nodded, pulling up emails and bank transfers on his screen. The HOA has been forcibly removing homeowners under false pretenses, then selling the properties at inflated prices through shell companies. Amanda's fingers tightened into fists. "And Victoria is at the center of it?" The reporter exhaled, nodding. "Not just her, but she's a key player. She's been managing the HOA's legal side, making sure the paperwork looks legitimate while homeowners are forced out." Amanda's head spun. This wasn't just about her garage. This was about dozens, maybe hundreds of families who had been pushed out of their homes. Henry crossed his arms. "So, what's our move?" The reporter leaned forward, his eyes serious. "We go public." Amanda knew going public would put a target on her back, but she was done being afraid. She had spent weeks dealing with threats, break-ins, and harassment, but now she had the truth on her side. The next morning, the reporter aired the investigation, exposing the HOA's illegal schemes. The broadcast included interviews with homeowners who had been forced out, financial documents showing suspicious transactions, and even hidden footage of HOA members discussing their deals. Amanda watched as the video spread like wildfire across social media, residents in her neighborhood sharing it, commenting, and demanding action. Within hours, city officials announced a full investigation into the HOA's practices. Victoria, who had always carried herself with confidence, was now nowhere to be seen. Amanda knew she had struck a nerve, but just as she started to feel a sense of relief, Henry called her from his car, his voice urgent. "Amanda," he said, his tone serious. "We got a problem." She gripped her phone, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Henry took a breath, his voice low. "Someone just followed me from the station. I think we've pushed them too far." Amanda had thought the worst was over, but as she sat in her living room, watching the breaking news, she realized this was just the beginning. The federal investigation was now in full swing, and Victoria had been arrested, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Henry sat across from her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Amanda, you know this isn't just about the HOA anymore," he said, his voice low. She nodded, eyes fixed on the television. The footage showed agents carrying boxes of documents from the HOA office, loading them into black SUVs. "What do you think they'll find?" she asked. Henry exhaled, rubbing his chin. If what Hastings gave us is accurate, this was way bigger than just Victoria. She wasn't working alone. Amanda's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up and saw a message from the reporter who had helped expose the corruption. "Meet me at the station. You need to see this." Amanda glanced at Henry, who had seen the text over her shoulder. "I don't like it," he said. "What if someone's watching you?" Amanda clenched her jaw. "We've come this far. I'm not stopping now." 20 minutes later, they arrived at the news station. The reporter waved them into a dimly lit room lined with file cabinets and stacks of papers. "I pulled more records," he said, motioning for them to sit. "This isn't just about forced evictions. They were laundering money, big money." Amanda's stomach twisted. "How big?" The reporter pulled out a document. "Enough to fund major land development projects. And guess who's been backing them?" He slid the paper toward them. Amanda picked it up, her eyes widening as she read the name. "Councilman Richard Warner." Henry let out a low whistle. "That explains a lot. The city's been turning a blind eye to this mess because the guy in charge was profiting from it." Amanda felt her pulse quicken. "We have to take this to the state." The reporter leaned forward. "That's the problem. Warner has friends in high places. If we go to the wrong people, this whole thing gets buried." Henry tapped his fingers against the table, deep in thought. "We need undeniable proof, something that forces their hand." The reporter pulled out another file. "This is what we have so far. Emails, bank transactions, testimonies from other homeowners. But we need someone who is on the inside." Amanda's mind raced. "Hastings." He flipped. "He might be willing to testify." Henry nodded. "If we can get him on record, we have a real shot at taking this all the way." They left the station, their next move clear: find Hastings before someone else did. Amanda felt the weight of everything pressing down on her, but she also felt something else: determination. They weren't just fighting for her home anymore. They were fighting for every homeowner who had been pushed out, manipulated, or silenced. And they weren't backing down. Tracking down Hastings wasn't going to be easy, but Amanda knew they didn't have a choice. If he had flipped once, it meant he was scared, and scared people either ran or tried to cut deals. Henry drove as Amanda scrolled through her phone, searching for any trace of him. He'd been careful. No social media presence, no recent business listings. He knew how to stay off the radar. "We need another angle," she muttered. Henry nodded. "I might know someone who can help." He pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place Amanda had never been. The neon sign flickered overhead, casting a faint glow on the cracked pavement. Inside, a man sat alone at a booth near the back, stirring a cup of coffee. His graying hair and sharp eyes made it clear he wasn't just some random customer. Henry led Amanda over. "This is Carter," he said. He used to run investigations on financial crimes before he retired. Carter looked Amanda up and down before nodding at Henry. "What's the job?" Henry slid the documents onto the table. "We need to find someone who doesn't want to be found." Carter skimmed the pages, his eyes narrowing at the name Hastings. Amanda watched as he pulled out a small notebook, jotting something down. This guy was a lawyer, right? That means he had to register his practice somewhere. Even if he shut everything down, there's always a paper trail. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up. "I might have something," he said, sliding out of the booth. "Come on." They followed him out of the diner and into a parking lot, where he leaned against his car and lit a cigarette. Hastings rented a place under a different name, but it's still his. It's about 20 minutes from here. Amanda felt her pulse quicken. If they could get to him before someone else did, they had a real chance of bringing this whole thing down. "Let's go," she said. The drive was tense, each turn making Amanda's stomach twist. When they reached the address, a small, run-down motel, Henry parked a few spaces away. They sat in silence for a moment, scanning the lot. No black SUVs. No signs of trouble. Yet, Amanda exhaled. "I'll go in." Henry shook his head. "No way. If this goes south, you're not in a position to handle it." Amanda shot him a look. "And you are?" Henry smirked. "I have experience. Stay here." She hated it, but she knew he was right. Henry got out and approached the motel, his steps casual but alert. Amanda watched as he disappeared inside, her fingers tapping anxiously against her knee. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door swung open again. Henry emerged with Hastings at his side, looking rattled but alive. "Get in," Henry ordered as he slid into the driver's seat. Hastings climbed into the back, glancing nervously out the window. Amanda turned to face him. "We need your testimony." Hastings swallowed hard. "You don't understand. They're watching everything. If I talk, I disappear." Amanda's jaw tightened. "You think staying quiet is safer? They're going down, whether you help or not. The only question is, do you want to go down with them?" Hastings ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "If I do this, I need full immunity." Henry met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "That's up to the feds. But if you cooperate, you've got a shot." Hastings hesitated before nodding. "Fine, I'll do it. But we need to move fast." Amanda glanced at Henry, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. This was it, the final step in bringing the whole operation down. Amanda didn't waste a second. She called the lead investigator and set up the meeting. Hastings sat in the back seat, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee as Henry drove. "Are you sure this is safe?" Hastings asked, his voice strained. Amanda glanced at Henry, who kept his eyes on the road. "Nothing is safe anymore," she muttered. "But this is the only way out." They pulled into a secured parking lot behind the federal building. The moment they stepped out, two agents approached, their expressions unreadable. Henry flashed his badge. His old connections still held weight. "We have information," he said, "and a witness." The agents nodded, motioning for them to follow. Inside, they were led to a conference room, where a woman in a dark suit sat waiting. Amanda recognized her as Agent Ramirez, the lead investigator on the case. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit," she said firmly. "Start from the beginning." Hastings swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. "I was hired to handle legal paperwork for the HOA," he began. "At first, it was basic, enforcing rules, filing complaints. But then things changed. They started targeting specific homeowners, making up violations to force them out." Amanda watched as he detailed how the HOA had been working with developers, secretly flipping foreclosed properties for profit. He provided names, documents, and even a recording of Victoria discussing kickbacks. Ramirez listened carefully, then tapped her pen against the table. "This is damning evidence," she said. "But if we don't act carefully, these people will disappear before we can arrest them." Henry leaned forward. "What's the plan?" Ramirez exhaled. "We go tonight. Federal agents are already stationed near the HOA headquarters. We have enough to issue warrants." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine. This was really happening. Hastings shifted uneasily. "And what about me? I gave you everything." Ramirez nodded. "You'll be placed under protection until the case is closed. But you better hope your testimony holds up in court." Henry checked his watch. "If they're moving tonight, we should be there." Amanda's stomach twisted. They had been fighting this battle for weeks, and now the final move was about to be made. Amanda stood outside the federal building, watching the agents prepare for the raid. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing down on her. Henry stood beside her, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the movements of the task force. "This is it," he muttered. "They either run or they fall." She nodded, gripping her phone tightly. The news was already spreading. Reporters had gathered near the HOA headquarters, waiting for the moment federal agents made their move. This wasn't going to be quiet. This was going to be loud. Inside the building, Agent Ramirez gave the final instructions. The warrants had been approved, and within the next hour, arrests would begin. Amanda and Henry were escorted to a nearby observation post, where they could watch everything unfold without being in the middle of it. As the clock ticked, Amanda's nerves were on edge. Then, just as the sun set, the first team moved in. From her vantage point, she saw federal agents storm into the HOA office, their presence commanding. Victoria was the first to be taken into custody, her normally composed expression now filled with shock and anger. As they handcuffed her, she screamed something at the officers, but no one was listening anymore. Then came the developers. One by one, the men behind the fraud were rounded up, some trying to protest, others too stunned to react. Amanda watched, her heart pounding, as they were all placed into waiting vehicles. "It's over," Henry said, exhaling slowly. Amanda felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was bittersweet. This fight had cost her a lot, time, stress, and sleepless nights, but it was finally done. Ramirez approached them, her expression unreadable. "You both did a hell of a job," she said. "Without you, this case would have been buried." Amanda gave a small nod. "We just wanted the truth to come out." Henry smirked. "And a little justice, too." Ramirez chuckled. "Well, you got both. The evidence you provided sealed their fate. They'll be going away for a long time." Amanda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked around, seeing the community members slowly gathering, watching as the people who had terrorized them were taken away. A few familiar faces stepped forward, Mrs. Patel, Mark, Sarah from next door. They thanked Amanda, their voices filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you," Mark said, his eyes sincere. Amanda shook her head. "This was a group effort. We all fought back." Henry nudged her shoulder. "But let's be honest, you led the charge." Amanda smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The corrupt HOA was gone, the neighborhood was safe, and now, for the first time, she could finally breathe. She turned to Henry. "Think the new HOA will be better?" He chuckled. "Well, they'd be stupid to mess with you again." Amanda laughed, the sound genuine. Maybe it was over. Maybe now life could finally go back to normal,